The war had left its mark on every corner of the galaxy. Planets once teeming with life were now scared by battle, their surfaces littered with the remnants of fallen ships and destroyed civilizations. Captain Ethan Cole, a human soldier, navigated his way through one such battlefield. An alien world, now silent after years of conflict. Ethan's mission was simple: recover any usable technology from the wreckage and return to base. But as his scanner beeped, detecting life among the ruins, he knew this day was about to take an unexpected turn. Life. Here, in the midst of all this destruction. His brow furrowed as he adjusted the scanner's sensitivity. The signal was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Moving cautiously, Ethan followed the source of the signal, his boots crunching over debris. A massive alien cruiser lay split open, its sleek metallic hull crumpled like paper. Inside, the air was stale, and the scent of burning circuits filled the atmosphere. His flashlight cut through the dim interior, highlighting broken consoles and scattered tools. Then, he saw it, a small, trembling figure half buried under a pile of twisted metal. It was an alien child, her skin a deep violet, with thin, delicate limbs and large, haunting eyes that stared at him in terror. She was wounded, her frail body covered in cuts and bruises, but she was alive. Ethan dropped to one knee, his voice calm and soft. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help." The child flinched, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't run. She couldn't. Ethan reached out, gently moving the metal aside to free her. His movements were slow, deliberate. He knew how fragile she looked and how important it was not to scare her more than she already was. "Can you understand me?" he asked, hoping she spoke one of the common intergalactic languages. The girl winced but nodded weakly. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." Relief flooded Ethan's chest. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe. You're hurt, but I can help. Do you trust me?" There was hesitation in her eyes, a deep wariness born of trauma, but after a long moment, she gave a tiny nod. Ethan scooped her up into his arms, careful not to jostle her injuries. She was so light, so fragile, and the weight of her situation weighed heavily on him. As they exited the wreckage, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her. The war had displaced so many, left so many children orphaned and alone. He had seen it before, but each time it struck him with the same force. These children were the real casualties of war. With her safely secured in his arms, Ethan tapped his comms device. "Cole to base. I found a survivor, requesting immediate evac." Back on the human transport ship, the alien girl lay motionless on a medical bed. The ship's doctor, an older woman named Dr. Valeria, worked with quiet efficiency, checking her vitals and tending to her wounds. Ethan stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving the girl. He had seen a lot during his years in service, but something about her situation struck him deeper than usual. Maybe it was the sheer helplessness in her eyes or the fact that she was so young, too young to be caught in the middle of a war this brutal. "She's in shock, but her injuries aren't life-threatening," Dr. Valeria said, snapping him out of his thoughts. "She'll need rest and proper care, but she'll make it." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Good. What about her species? Do you recognize it?" Dr. Valeria shook her head. "Not exactly. She's likely from one of the fringe systems, species we don't usually encounter. But she's humanoid enough that the medical protocols will work." The girl stirred, her violet eyes fluttering open. Ethan knelt down beside her, his voice soft. "Hey, you're safe now. We're going to help you." The girl's gaze shifted to Ethan, still filled with fear but also something else, curiosity. She had never seen a human before, not up close like this. Her people had spoken of humans as dangerous, war-hungry creatures, but this one had saved her. "Why?" she asked in a voice so small it was almost inaudible. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Why what? Why did you help me? I'm not. One of you. Ethan smiled, though there was a sadness behind it. You needed help. That's all that matters. The girl didn't respond immediately, her gaze dropping to the blanket that covered her. She seemed to be trying to process his words, as if they didn't quite fit into the reality she had been taught. Her people had been at war with the humans for years. Why would one save her? Dr. Valeria interrupted their moment. She needs rest, Captain. We can ask questions later. Reluctantly, Ethan nodded and stood, heading towards the door. But just before he left, the girl whispered something he barely caught. Thank you. He turned to look at her once more, but her eyes had already closed, exhaustion pulling her into a deep sleep. Ethan stared for a moment longer, then quietly left the room. As the door hissed shut behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something he couldn't yet understand. Ethan leaned against the cold metal wall outside the medical bay, his mind swirling with questions. Who was this child? Where were her parents? And why had she been left behind in the wreckage? The war had taken many lives, but something about this girl's situation gnawed at him. His combust, snapping him back to reality. It was Sergeant Jackson, his second in command. Captain, what's your status? We've got a few scavenger ships trying to break through our perimeter. They're looking for scraps from the battlefield. Understood, Ethan replied, shaking off his distraction. I'll be up in a minute. He switched off the cam and glanced back at the door. The girl was resting now, safe for the time being. But Ethan couldn't shake the nagging sense of responsibility that had settled over him the moment he'd found her. He knew this was more than just a passing rescue mission. There was something deeper at play. The child was not just a survivor, she was a symbol of what was lost in the endless violence. And now, she was under his care. Ethan made a silent promise to himself. He would see her to safety, no matter what it took. Back on the bridge, Ethan surveyed the situation. The scavenger ships were small, cobbled-together vessels, likely crewed by pirates or opportunists trying to pick through the remnants of the battle. They weren't a real threat, but their presence was a reminder that this war had left the galaxy in chaos. Captain, Jackson called, what do you want us to do with those scavengers? They're getting too close for comfort. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't in the mood for more conflict, not after what he'd just witnessed. Give them a warning shot. If they don't back off, we'll handle them, but I don't want a firefight unless absolutely necessary. Jackson nodded and relayed the order to the gunnery crew. Moments later, a blast of energy shot across the void, narrowly missing the scavenger ships. It was enough to get the message across. The vessels quickly veered off, retreating into the darkness. Ethan let out a breath, glad to avoid further bloodshed. His thoughts drifted back to the girl. She was too young to be caught in this madness. He had seen so many orphaned by the war, both human and alien. But each time it felt like a failure, a reminder of how far things had spiraled out of control. Captain, Jackson's voice broke through his thoughts again. We're getting a signal from command. They want an update on the salvage mission. Ethan nodded. Patch them through. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the face of Commander Harlan, his superior officer, Captain Cole. I'm receiving your report about the survivor. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Ethan replied. We found a young alien child in the wreckage. She's injured but stable. We're bringing her back to base. Harlan's expression didn't change, but there was a tension in his voice. We need to know more about her species. This war has made it difficult to trust anyone. You understand the protocol. She will have to undergo a full security screening once you return. Ethan bristled at the implication. With all due respect, sir, she's just a child. She's no threat. I don't doubt your assessment, Captain, but you know the risks. Any alien, especially one found on the battlefield, could pose a danger. You're to follow protocol, no exceptions. Ethan gritted his teeth. He understood the rules, but it didn't sit right with him. This child had been abandoned, left to die in the wreckage. She wasn't an enemy combatant, but orders were orders, and he had no choice but to comply. "Understood, sir," Ethan replied stiffly. The hologram flickered out, leaving Ethan alone with his frustration. He didn't like it, but he knew he couldn't defy command without risking his career. Still, the girl's terrified eyes lingered in his mind. "Captain, we're clear of the scavengers," Jackson reported, pulling Ethan back to the present. "Good. Set a course for base. Let's get this over with." As the ship made its way through the cold expanse of space, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something about this child was different. There was more to her story, something that went beyond the usual aftermath of war. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he was determined to find out. He had promised to protect her, and Ethan Cole wasn't the kind of man to break a promise. The transport ship sliced through the inky darkness of space, the stars barely a blur in the distance. Ethan stood on the bridge, staring out into the void, lost in thought. Below, in the medical bay, the alien girl slept, recovering from her injuries. But even as the ship hummed steadily toward the safety of the human outpost, Ethan couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. His mind replayed the conversation with Commander Harlan. Protocols were there for a reason, but the girl, her innocence, her fragility, it didn't sit right with him that she would be treated like a potential threat. She was just a child, and whatever world she came from, it had likely been ripped apart by the same war that had scared the galaxy. "Captain," Jackson said, breaking the silence, "ETA to base is 3 hours." Ethan nodded, but remained silent. The weight of his responsibility grew heavier by the minute. Who was this girl? What horrors had she seen? And why had she been abandoned, alone in the wreckage of a ship? His thoughts shifted to darker possibilities. Was she the last survivor of her kind? Had her family been wiped out by the very forces Ethan served? Pushing the grim thoughts aside, Ethan made his way back to the medical bay. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. When he entered, Dr. Valeria was still at her station, monitoring the girl's vitals. She glanced up, her expression calm but knowing. "She's stable," Valeria said. "Her injuries are healing well, though her mental state will need time." Ethan nodded, looking over to the small figure on the bed. The girl's violet skin seemed even more delicate under the soft glow of the medical lights. Her breathing was steady, but there was an air of fragility that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Is she awake?" he asked. Dr. Valeria glanced at her monitor. "She's been in and out, but I think she's aware enough if you want to talk to her." Ethan stepped closer to the bed and knelt down, his voice gentle. "Hey, it's me again. Do you remember?" The girl's eyes slowly fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze, but then recognition dawned. She nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "What's your name?" Ethan asked softly, hoping to gain her trust. The girl hesitated, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "I'm called Kellery," she whispered. "Kellery," Ethan repeated, offering a small smile. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Ethan. You're safe now, Kellery. I promise." She blinked at him, her large eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where am I?" "You're on a human ship," Ethan explained, his tone careful. "We're taking you to a place where you'll be safe, where you can heal." Kellery's gaze drifted to the walls around her, her small fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "Why did you save me? Humans and my people, we are at war." Ethan sighed, kneeling beside her bed. "You're right. There's a war, but I'm not here to hurt you, Kellery. I'm here because you needed help, and that's what matters. You were alone, wounded. I couldn't leave you behind." Kellery studied him for a long moment, her violet eyes filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "My family, they were on the ship, the one you found me in." "Are they?" Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't have the heart to tell her, but the wreckage had been clear. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. There was no one else, just you. The girl's expression shattered. Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned her face away, biting her lip to keep from crying aloud. Ethan's heart ached at the sight. War had taken so much from so many, but watching it break a child like this felt unbearable. "I'm so sorry," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish I could have done more." For a long time, there was only silence between them. Hillary's small frame trembled with suppressed sobs, and Ethan didn't know what more he could say. His duty was to protect her now, but he couldn't bring back what she had lost. After a while, Hillary spoke, her voice small and broken. "Why did this happen? Why do we fight?" Ethan didn't have an easy answer. He had asked himself that same question many times over the years. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's complicated. Some say it's for resources, for power. Others fight out of fear. But whatever the reason, the ones who suffer most are the ones who don't have a say." Hillary looked at him, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion. "I don't want to fight anymore." Ethan reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Neither do I." For the first time since he had found her, Hillary's expression softened. The war had taken everything from her, but here, with this human soldier who had chosen to save her instead of leaving her to die, she found a small glimmer of hope. Maybe not all humans were the monsters her people had said they were. "I won't let anything happen to you," Ethan promised, his grip firm but reassuring. "As long as I'm here, you're safe." Hillary nodded weakly, her eyes closing once more. Exhaustion pulled her back into sleep, but this time, there was a small measure of peace in her expression. As Ethan stood and made his way to the door, Dr. Valeria spoke softly behind him. "You're doing the right thing, Captain." Ethan paused, glancing back at the girl. "I hope so, but we're not out of this yet." He knew the road ahead would be difficult. Command wouldn't be satisfied with a simple rescue. They would have questions about her species, her origins, and whether she posed any threat. Ethan could only hope that when the time came, he could protect her from more than just the scars of war. Ethan's feet echoed down the corridor of the ship as he made his way toward the command center. His mind was a whirlpool of thoughts. Hillary was just a child, yet her very existence was now a point of contention. He knew the moment they docked at the human outpost, she would be treated as a potential threat, questioned and analyzed. He couldn't let that happen. When he arrived at the command center, the officers inside straightened at his approach. Commander Harlan, who had been monitoring their progress from a console, turned to face him, arms crossed. "Captain," Harlan greeted, his expression neutral but unreadable. "How's our guest?" Ethan stiffened slightly. "She's recovering. Dr. Valeria says her physical wounds aren't serious, but she's traumatized. She's a child, Commander." "A child of an enemy species," Harlan replied, his tone measured. "We don't know anything about her people, Cole. For all we know, she could be a Trojan horse." Ethan felt his frustration rise, but kept it in check. "I found her alone in the wreckage of a destroyed ship. She's scared and alone. We can't just treat her like a threat." Harlan eyed Ethan with a mixture of skepticism and concern. "We have protocols for a reason. We don't know what she's capable of. Her species might have abilities we aren't aware of. You saw what happened on Drakner Station. An entire crew wiped out by a single alien who looked harmless." "That was different," Ethan countered, his voice steady. "This is a kid, Commander. We've got to be better than this. If we treat every survivor like a threat, we're no better than the people we're fighting." For a long moment, Harlan was silent, considering Ethan's words. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I get where you're coming from, Cole. I do, but it's not that simple. We have to protect our own. If she's innocent, great, we'll give her refuge. But we need to be sure." Ethan clenched his fists but nodded. He knew Harlan was only doing his job, following the protocols that had kept humanity alive through countless conflicts. But the image of Kellery's frightened face haunted him. She didn't deserve to be treated like a weapon just because of her species. "I'll take responsibility for her," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens, it's on me. Just give her a chance." Harlan studied him for a long moment, weighing the request. "All right," he said finally. "But I'll need to report this to command. They'll want answers." "Understand," Ethan replied, relieved to have some measure of control over the situation. "I'll do what I can to make sure she's safe." With that, Harlan turned back to his console, and Ethan left the command center, his mind already working on the next steps. He had bought Kellery some time, but the real challenge was still ahead. He needed to gain her trust, to help her adjust to life aboard a human vessel without feeling like a prisoner. As he made his way back to the medical bay, his comms device beeped. It was Dr. Valeria. "Captain, Kellery's awake again," Valeria said. "She's asking for you." Ethan quickened his pace. Arriving at the medical bay moments later, Kellery was sitting up slightly, her violet eyes scanning the room nervously. When she saw Ethan, some of the tension in her face eased. "Ethan," she whispered, the sound of his name still foreign on her tongue. He smiled warmly and sat beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" Kellery hesitated, her gaze darting around the room before settling on him. "Better, I think." "That's good," Ethan said, leaning forward slightly. "Listen, I need to talk to you about something important." Kellery's eyes widened, uncertainty creeping back into her expression. Ethan could tell she was afraid of what might come next. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said gently. "The people on this ship, they're going to ask questions. They don't know your species, and that makes them nervous. But I promised I'd protect you, and I will. You just need to trust me." Kellery's small hands gripped the edge of the blanket tightly, her knuckles turning pale against her violet skin. "What will they do to me?" Ethan frowned. "They'll probably ask you about where you're from, your people, that kind of thing, but I won't let them hurt you. I'll be with you the whole time." Kellery stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. She had grown up hearing tales of humans, ruthless, brutal, and warlike. But Ethan wasn't like that. He had saved her, spoken to her with kindness, and even now, he was promising to protect her. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. "Trust you." Relief washed over Ethan, but there was still a long way to go. He had to navigate a delicate balance, protecting Kellery while also satisfying the suspicions of his superiors. "There's something else," Kellery said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before the attack, my people, they were working on something. I don't know what it was, but I heard them talking about it. They said it was dangerous, that it could end the war." Ethan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Do you know what it was?" Kellery shook her head. "No, but they were scared, and now think that's why they were attacked." Ethan's mind raced. If Kellery's people had been developing some kind of superweapon, it could explain the sudden and brutal assault on their ship. But if word got out, it could also make her a target for more than just the humans. "You're safe with me," Ethan assured her. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Kellery nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fully dissipate. She was carrying a burden far greater than any child should, and Ethan knew they were both walking a fine line between survival and disaster. As he left the medical bay, his resolve hardened. He would protect Kellery, no matter the cost. But now, he had to find out more. About her people, about the weapon, and about the truth behind the attack that had left her stranded and alone. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and whispered conversations. Ethan kept a close eye on Kellery, making sure she was comfortable while also keeping her presence under the radar. The crew was curious, but Commander Harlan had instructed them to stay out of it for the time being. Despite the relative calm, Ethan's thoughts kept returning to Kallari's cryptic words. Her people had been working on something dangerous, something powerful enough to end a war. If that was true, it could change everything. But why hadn't the humans known about it before the attack? And who else might be after that secret? One evening, Ethan stood in front of a holoscreen in his quarters, pulling up every piece of information the Human Intelligence Network had on Kallari's species. He scrolled through long reports, but the data was sparse. Her people, the Adarians, were reclusive and rarely ventured beyond their own star systems. They had no formal alliances, no real trade routes, and no presence in the wider galactic community. They stayed hidden for a reason, Ethan muttered to himself, leaning back in his chair. His comms device beeped. It was Dr. Valeria again. "Captain, you need to come to the medical bay. Kallari's awake, and I think you need to hear what she's saying." Ethan immediately headed out, the urgency in Dr. Valeria's voice setting him on edge. When he arrived, Kallari was sitting up, her expression more alert than he had seen since the rescue. Valeria gave him a small nod and gestured toward the girl, stepping back to give them privacy. Ethan approached cautiously, sensing that something had shifted. "Kallari, what's wrong?" The alien child's eyes were wide, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the blanket around her. "I remembered something important." Ethan sat down beside her, his tone gentle but firm. "It's okay. Take your time. Tell me what you remembered." Kallari swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "The weapon, the thing my people were working on. It wasn't meant to end the war. It was meant to destroy everything. They wanted to wipe out entire planets, whole civilizations." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What? Why would they do that?" Kallari looked down at her hands, her small fingers twisting together. They were desperate. They thought, if they could show how powerful they were, no one would ever challenge them again. But the others, those who attacked us, they found out. They wanted to stop it, to take the weapon for themselves. Ethan's mind raced. This wasn't just about a single battle or a conflict between two factions. This was about galactic destruction on an unimaginable scale. If what Kallari said was true, her people had been on the brink of unleashing something that could have wiped out countless lives, human and alien alike. "Do you know where this weapon is now?" Ethan asked, his voice low and tense. Kallari shook her head. "No, my parents, they didn't tell me everything, but I heard them say it was hidden. They were afraid it would be found." Ethan's pulse quickened. A weapon like that couldn't be left unchecked, especially if it had fallen into the wrong hands. "Kallari, this is really important. If anyone finds that weapon, we're all in danger. Do you remember anything else? Anything that could help us figure out where it might be?" Kallari's brow furrowed in concentration, and after a long moment, she nodded slightly. "There was a name, a place my parents mentioned. I think it was Volta Prime." Ethan's eyes widened. Volta Prime was a distant, uninhabited planet on the edge of the known galaxy. It was a place that had been used for secret military operations in the past, a desolate world where no one ventured unless they had a very good reason. "That's a start," Ethan said, his mind already planning the next steps. "We'll need to check it out, see if there's anything there, but I'm going to need your help, Kallari. If you remember anything else, anything at all, you have to tell me." Kallari nodded, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "I will." Ethan stood, his mind racing with possibilities. If the weapon was on Volta Prime, there was a chance they could find it and destroy it before it could be used. But they wouldn't be the only ones looking. Whoever had attacked Kallari's ship would be after it too, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way. Before leaving the medical bay, Ethan turned back to Kallari, his voice firm but reassuring. "We'll figure this out. I promise you're not alone in this." The girl gave him a small, hesitant smile, the weight of her burden still heavy on her shoulders. But for the first time since they had found her, There was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Ethan left the medical bay, his heart pounding. He had to inform Commander Harlan, but he knew this mission would be anything but easy. They were walking into dangerous territory, both politically and physically. If they didn't handle it carefully, the weapon could fall into the wrong hands, triggering a catastrophe beyond anyone's control. As he reached the command center, Ethan's resolve hardened. He had saved Hillary's life, and now he would protect her, no matter the cost. But more than that, he would ensure that the weapon her people had created, this monstrous thing capable of ending worlds, would never see the light of day. Walter Prime, are you out of your mind, Captain? Commander Harlan's voice echoed through the dimly lit room as he stared at Ethan in disbelief. The two men were alone in the strategy chamber, holomaps and data feeds flickering around them. Ethan had just relayed everything Hillary had told him about the weapon, and Harlan was struggling to process it all. I know it sounds insane, Ethan replied, keeping his voice steady. But if that weapon is out there, we can't ignore it. We have to destroy it before anyone else gets to it. Harlan rubbed a hand across his face, pacing in front of the map. This could start a war, Cole. If we go after something like this without clearance from command, we're risking everything. Not to mention, Walter Prime is in neutral space. We don't have jurisdiction there. Ethan folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. We're already in a war, Commander. And if we don't stop this, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. Whoever attacked Hillary's people is probably already on their way to that planet. We can't just sit here and wait for them to use that thing. Harlan stopped pacing, turning to face Ethan with a frown. You're willing to bet everything on the word of a child. She's not lying, Ethan said firmly. I have seen the fear in her eyes. She's telling the truth. Harlan stared at him for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he let out a long sigh and nodded. All right, Captain. We'll go to Walter Prime. But this is off the books. No one can know what we're after. Ethan's expression didn't change, but inside, he felt a wave of relief. Understood, sir. Harlan glanced at the map again, a grim look settling over his features. Prepare the crew for departure. We'll make the jump to Walter Prime within the hour. As Ethan left the strategy chamber, his mind was already racing ahead. This mission was a long shot, an impossible gamble that could either save the galaxy or doom it. But one thing was certain, they couldn't afford to fail. Back in the medical bay, Hillary was waiting, her eyes wide with apprehension when Ethan returned. He gave her a reassuring nod. We're going to Walter Prime, he told her. We're going to stop this. Hillary's gaze searched his, looking for any sign of doubt. She found none. Thank you, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Ethan knelt beside her bed, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. We're in this together, kid. I won't let anything happen to you. As the ship prepared for its dangerous mission, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out.